Okay, so welcome everyone to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 advisory group. I also teach history at Suffolk. And our guest this week is Friederike Baer, who is an associate professor of history and the division head for arts and humanities at Pennsylvania State University's Abington College. And we're here to talk about her new book, which is on the Hessians. It's from what I have read, it is a great book about the Hessian experience in the war. So, Friederike, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
So you were just saying that the regiments all kept diaries, they kept journals, and so there's a tremendous amount of stuff there for those who can read German.
Yes. In fact, when I set out on this project, which is many years ago, I was not aware of the fact that there was so much archival material available that was penned by members of the German Corps, whether it was officers or civilian employees, chaplains, surgeons, and others. So we do have some material that has been published, translated into English and published, including a couple of memoirs, some letters, materials like that, but a huge volume remains in German and also in American archives. And it's not just mostly written in German, but it's also whatever's written in German is written in the old German script. So that's, I think, another reason why so much of this material has remained unexplored by historians, by American historians in particular. It's not necessarily easy to access at this point.
Right. Yeah. So something like 30,000 Germans served in the American War for Independence. So what brought them into the war? What were they? How did they come to be part of this?
Yeah, so 30,000 is the kind of the accepted number. Some historians have argued it may have been more than that. The number doesn't necessarily also include civilians. And we have to remember that the troops were accompanied by hundreds of women and also children, camp followers, pretty normal in the 18th century.
Right.
They came to America because Britain essentially recognized very early on, at least as soon as war breaks out in the spring of 75, that the number of soldiers that are stationed in North America are not going to suffice in putting down this rebellion. So early on, they think, well, maybe we'll need 20,000 troops, something like that. And Britain does what it has done many times before, namely turn to foreign rulers to hire troops. The king first turned to Russia. The hope was to get 20,000 men. That didn't work out. Britain also tried to recall what was known as the Scots Brigade that was in the Dutch service at the time. That also didn't work out. By the summer of 75, a couple of German rulers had already offered troops. Again, this was a long-standing practice, accepted at the time in Europe. By the fall and winter by the end of that year, Britain sent an emissary to Braunschweig and then to Hessen-Kassel and different territories to conclude these, what we know as subsidy treaties, to essentially rent units, military units. The goal was to get as many as these men to North America in 76 for a major campaign.
Wow. So when you say renting units, can you tell us a bit about how that worked?
Yeah, so the German rulers essentially agreed to supply Britain with a certain number of troops. They're all infantry regiments, and in exchange for payments. So the rulers got subsidies, fairly significant annual payments. Of course, in 75, 76, no one knows how long the war will last.
Right.
Britain thinks it's going to last very long. But the subsidy treaties sort of lay out all the details about how long the payment, stuff like that. The German rulers agreed to raise those units. And what they had to do is recruit, for the most part, men into the service. In other words, they did not have, sometimes, this idea that they just have these troops ready to go, well-trained. That's not the case. So they're using troops that are available, but they are needed to build up, complement whatever the regiments to get them up to strength. Get them equipped, and then send them into British service. And that had to happen very, very quickly in early 76, basically, to get them out by the late spring.
So actually, next week on Christmas, the night of Christmas, we have one of the big events that involves the Hessians in the American War for Independence, the siege at the Battle of Trenton.
Right.
So there's a lot of myths about the German soldiers too. So one is that they were ill prepared, they had been celebrating. Can you tell us more about what these guys were like as soldiers?
Yeah, I don't think they were drunk. That's one of you get that day. What were they like as soldiers? I mean, that is a really good question. When I went through, in my book, first couple of chapters really deal with recruiting these men and getting them to North America, and I argue that a good number of these men are fresh recruits who don't have a lot of military service. They're fairly young men on average. There are many are poor, rural, which is not necessarily surprising. But if Britain hoped to get a sort of a well-trained army to America quickly, that was only partly the case. I think many of these soldiers actually were not seasoned veterans. So when they are, and Trenton in particular, I mean, I think Trenton is very well known in American history because, as we all know, it's a morale-boosting event after a campaign that had not gone very well for the Americans, and it's something led by Washington. It gives him, it enhances his reputation to some extent.
Yeah.
Well, the Germans at Trenton, the troops that are in winter quarters there. It is, of course, a humiliating event. They called it the unfortunate affair, that they were attacked by these Americans. But I think what's important to keep in mind is the commander of, there's no doubt that Johann Rall, who commanded the garrison at Trenton, is failed in really rallying the troops, to so to speak, and mounting effective defense. But it's important to keep in mind, too, that he actually had distinguished himself at the attack on Fort Washington. He seemed to have been very well liked by his men. And he was mortally wounded at Trenton, so he never had a chance to defend himself and explain his position. So when there were hearings afterwards, and there were hearings, I mean, these officers, there was like a couple of years later in New York, there was like military, like what happened, It was relatively easy, I think, for officers to point the finger at Rall and say, like, he was just ineffective, there was chaos, The German view of Trenton is that it was a unfair, in a sense, attack, Christmas, an attack, it was a snowstorm, their cannon weapons, many ineffective, they were greatly outnumbered, they were in winter quarters. It had been an exhausting campaign. They just didn't, they did not think, the soldiers themselves and the officers that were there and survived did not think that they had done anything wrong. They did not necessarily think it reflected poorly on their own, courage or on their own abilities as soldiers. Rulers in Germany, in the meantime, of course, were a little worried that this defeat would potentially diminish British interest in hiring German soldiers. That did not happen. They did not need to worry about that. If anything, these kind of defeats increased interest in German soldiers because you needed even more men, to put down.
Right.
Yeah.
I think
Americans is important, but I think that from a German perspective, yes, it's humiliating, it's embarrassing, but I don't really think it radically changed their view of the enemy. I don't really think that it had as a profound impact on the Hessians as it did, I think, on the Americans.
Right. Okay. Thank you. What was their view of the enemy? I mean, what kind of ideas did they have about Americans? What kind of things were they expecting when they came over?
That's a really good question. When the war breaks out, an estimated 80,000 or so Germans had emigrated to North America. Of course, immigration had been huge. Most of them living in places like Pennsylvania, Maryland, mid-Atlantic region for the most part. So you would think that because all these people had come over, Germans knew a lot about America. People write letters back. There's like promotional literature that's being published, extolling the virtues of North America. But my sense from reading these records was that the soldiers and civilians that go to North America to fight in this war know very little about what they're about to enter. They, first of all, they come from regions that had not seen large-scale immigration in Germany. So remember, Germany does not exist. It's part of the Holy Roman Empire, maybe 300 or so territories. And so Hessen, Kassel, Waldeck, Anhalt-Zerbst, these places had not sent a lot of Germans to America to settle there and presumably settle their home and tell their families what it's all about. In addition, German-speaking Europeans generally did not know much about the imperial conflict. There's very little in published form, at least, that is circulated that would explain the causes for the war, what's going on, why the colonies had issues with the king or a parliament or whatever. The number of publications increases drastically once German soldiers enter the war, because suddenly Germans are like, what's going on? There's all these Germans fighting.
Right.
But until then, very limited. So I think the average German soldier maybe was curious, but certainly curious. I think that's one reason why we have all these diaries where they talk a lot about what they see. But knew little, certainly did not really appreciate differences between, say, Canada and I don't know, Georgia. It's like all North America is sort of one thing. And did not understand why this war, the causes for the war. And over the course of the war, generally exhibited very little curiosity and interest in finding out more.
Interesting. We're talking with Friederike Baer, who is the author of The Hessians, a book about the Germans in the American War for Independence, German soldiers in the American Revolutionary War. And so you have these great diaries from them. They're recording their experiences. What happens to some of them after the war? I mean, that's kind of so they didn't know anything about North America. Suddenly they're part of this war. And then if they survive, does this change them at all? What happens to some of them after the war?
So the soldiers, I mean, it varies, the experiences varied widely. We estimate that, first of all, about 7,500 died, maybe 1,200 in combat, the rest of disease, which were very common for 18th century. Disease is by far the greatest killer, I think, as we know. So then we have about 23,000 or so survivors. Of those, 5,000 or 6,000 stayed in North America. So they obviously, for whatever reason, felt that they had a better prospects in North America. It's quite possible that that's especially true for people that spent extensive periods of time as prisoners of war. They may have worked for local farms and employees. Maybe they met a woman. Maybe they wanted to get married or got married already. So we have 5,000 or 6,000 of those. I do want to emphasize that more than half of them actually ended up in Canada, which remained, of course, part of the British Empire. Britain offered land grants to soldiers who decided to settle there in places like Nova Scotia and Quebec and other provinces. The soldiers that remained in Canada and also in the United States, what was then in the United States, seem to have done quite well. My book does not go into that. That would have been probably volume 2.
Right.
But generally speaking, they seem to establish themselves at some point on property and stuff like that. The other ones, the vast majority, 17,000 or so, go back to Germany. Sometimes when people hear about the Hessians, they're like, "Oh, didn't they all stay in America?" Well, that's not the case. These soldiers have families at home. They always have ties to their there's a sense of loyalty.
Right.
Also, I think it's really not clear at all what would happen to the newly founded United States after the war. The war has been devastating. Who knows whether this will be a prosperous nation at some point. So the vast majority of Germans decide to go back and to their own territories. And they were often referred to as the Americans in German sources after that. The
Really?
Amerikaner. Yeah, you hear that term. So they're coming back with a lot of stories and experiences.
Yeah.
That I'm
Interesting.
sure people were eager to hear about.
One of the sources that's been translated is the memoir of Baroness von Riedesel, which is a great story. Can you tell us a bit more about her and what brings her to North America?
Yeah, it's a really great book, and I think it was at this point was translated in the 60s. It remains a really good translation with introductions, so I highly recommend it. Friederike Riedesel was the wife of Adolf Riedesel, who was the commander of the Braunschweig Corps. He was appointed to lead that corps. He went to Canada with the Braunschweig forces in 1776. She, his wife, followed him a little bit later because when he left, she was actually pregnant and she expected the third child. They already had 2 young daughters, so she didn't feel like she could travel in that state. So she had the child, and then with some delay because of weather and so forth, she does join her husband in Canada with 3 young children, and basically baby and 2 toddlers. And she went with them with Burgoyne on the ill-fated campaign into New York. At first, Burgoyne said this was not the kind of thing that a woman should do. She insisted, and she went with the Corps. As we all know, did not end well. They were captured or defeated at Saratoga. The entire army becomes known as the Convention Army, and most of them went into captivity, and she's one of them. So she and her husband end up captives. They stay where these Germans were first sent to Boston. And then the following year, they were moved to Charlottesville, Virginia. The Riedesels themselves stayed there for 5 months or so, and then they were exchanged and eventually returned to Canada. She kept apparently notes or diary through the entire time, and they were published in Germany. I think the first private edition came out in 1799, edited, I think, by her son-in-law, and then another edition was published in 1800, partly because the publisher thought this is people are really interested, and then it went through several editions. It's a very unique perspective. I mean, she's at Saratoga, watching the battle. Steve offers us carried into the house, literally one of them dying on her dining room table. And it's an interesting perspective that is unlike, I think, any other view that we have of the war.
It really is. So the son-in-law would have been married. Yes, the son-in-law would have been married to one of those women who had been a little girl at the time of the toddler.
That's right. So she has these 3 daughters. When they're in America, the Riedesels actually have 2 more daughters.
Wow.
One is called America, and the other one is called Canada. Canada did not survive infancy, but America survived. I think she died in the 1850s. And then when they returned to Germany, they have 2 more children. The long-awaited son, George, and Charlotte, named after the British king.
The king and queen.
So it's amazing. So it's a fascinating account, and I really recommend it if you can find the used edition or whatever. It's a really great perspective.
It really is. So we're talking with Friederike Baer, and I'll recommend her book, Hessians, on the German soldiers in the American Revolutionary War. Now, are there other characters we've talked about the ill-fated Roll, and we've talked about the Baroness von Riedesel, also ill-fated. Are there any other characters who stand out that you've come across in looking through all of these journals and letters?
Well, one, I think one that I think if for anyone who's read a little bit about the Germans, a name that is probably familiar, Johann Ewald. Johann Ewald is a Jäger, and he, which is basically the equivalent of a sort of a rifleman. These were hunters that were recruited into the Corps. They turned out to be very useful in the American War. He keeps a diary. He also writes letters. Survives the war. That diary has been published, and he also publishes actually a couple of military treaties in Germany about sort of the Petite Guerre, warfare, and he uses examples from the American War to illustrate tactics. Ewald is interesting too because he has a lot of insight into. He comments a lot on British leadership. Speculates later why this war was lost or what could have been done differently. Another one.
What does he think could have been done differently?
He says things like, throughout the war, the British have a few men in a lot of places and a lot of men in few places. In other words, they're too spread out.
Right.
They're too spread out, and he thinks it's never enough really to really launch a decisive campaign. He also, and others look at that, we should have stayed in Boston, should have started there. Other officers also agree that British reliance on the Navy is a major handicap. In other words, this idea that you have to stay essentially always connected to the shore, so you can be supplied and be depending on that, those kind of things. Another diary that I would recommend is by a chaplain. His name is Waldeck. His last name is Waldeck. He also happens to be from the territory of Waldeck, so easy to remember. What's interesting about him is he arrives in North America in 1976. He sent accounts or kind of reports back to Waldeck to be published during the war in a serialized form in a periodical. So this is definitely something that people at home in Germany basically are interested in learning about. There are a couple of versions of his diary that exist. One is in the Bancroft collection at the New York Public Library, and there's another one, I think maybe at Penn. What is interesting about him is that the Waldeck regiment, it's only one regiment, it's called the 3rd Regiment, maybe a total of 1,200 men served in the war. They were in New York, but most remarkably, and to me, interestingly, they also served in West Florida. It's the only regiment that fought against the Spanish. They fight along the Mississippi. They helped work out, but tried to protect the British forts held there. And then they were at the siege of Pensacola, and many of them entered captivity, Spanish captivity. So his account really sheds light on a place and aspect of the war that is often neglected. People often don't know that there was a war in Florida.
That's right. Yeah.
So his becomes very, and then the interesting, I saw in the notes you mentioned Basmus, and there's other published journals like that, and then there are a handful of manuscript journals as well. Johann Reuber, I want to mention, Johannes Reuber is one of the very few journals by a private. He was captured at Trenton. He survived the war. That journal was excerpts. Maybe I don't remember now the whole thing, but were published in a periodical in English at the turn of around 1900. So there's hard to find. It's available. The original is in Kassel. So lots of interesting perspectives. Members of different units in very different kind of positions within the army as well.
We're talking with Friederike Baer, author of Hessians, the German soldiers in the American Revolutionary War. Now, what first brought you to this topic, wanting to write a book about it?
When I took a class on the Revolutionary War in college. So I started at a German university, but then transferred to an American college, and that's really the first time when I really learned more about the German participation. I hadn't been aware that there were so many of them, and that was, I think, a bigger part. They deserved it to be a bigger part of the story than So that was a long time ago in college. I wrote my thesis, actually, my undergraduate thesis on the Convention Army. Then I did other things. Always been interested in it, and actually, at this point, it's 10 years ago. Started out with a much more focused topic, and that is write something about Friederike Riedesel, who you mentioned earlier. I was on her journal, I think also, honestly, underappreciated.
Yes.
And then that turned into just a much bigger project, because I realized they there are so many gaps in our understanding of the Hessians.
Right.
The more comprehensive studies, and they tend to be very traditional military histories, are basically from the 19th century. I'm not exaggerating. We
Yes.
have some great work done on, for example, German prisoners of war, and different units. There's a good book on specifically Hessen-Kassel, for example. So I don't want to suggest that no one has worked on this at all, but I felt that we didn't really have a more comprehensive
Right.
study that covers the entire war, covers all the regions in the Americas at least, and that covers all troops from the 6 territories. And so I decided to just gradually become a bigger and bigger project.
Well, good for you. I'm glad you did, because even though, as you said, there are pieces of it, really good books on pieces of it, there isn't something that can answer this question, like who are they from different parts of Germany, and what were they doing that isn't written in a technical military history way, but it's really social history, exploring their lives and so on. What has been the biggest surprise to you in doing this? Or what are some of I want to talk about things that surprised you, and then B, some of the other myths we may have about the Hessians, who they were, that you found actually not to be the case, or to be the case.
Well, a couple of things that surprised me generally about their role was that one I already mentioned, and that is their participation in the war against Spain. The fact that thousands of German troops, and in fact the number increases over the course of the war, spent the entire time in Canada. It was something that I had to really remind myself of when I was writing, that we know now that the America never attempted another attack on Canada after the initial failed venture into the province. Yes. But they don't know that.
Right.
So they're there, and they are concerned that there's going to be another, and especially after France enters the war, they're very worried that there might be a French fleet showing up at some point. Sure. So those kind of experiences. The other thing that I found really interesting is their view on slavery, the of the land, and then also their very extensive descriptions of Native Americans.
Right. Yeah.
So their comment on all of this, no matter where they are, in significant detail. They're appalled by slavery. They are not necessarily shocked that this is a society where there are servants and masters, so to speak. They come from societies that are incredibly stratified. I mean, there were still serfs in Hessian at the time.
Right.
The way that the Black men, women, and children were treated by white Americans really shocked them. And they do comment on the exploitation, on the oppression, and on the brutality and the violence. And they do that everywhere. They do that in New York and in the northern states, in Canada. And then, of course, they do it even more so in the southern states But so that was interesting. Related to that somehow is also, we know, of course, that tens of thousands of black men, women, and children sought refuge with the British Army, especially after proclamations were issued by British commanders, really encouraging enslaved people to run away and join the army, essentially. Some of them attached themselves to German regiments. And the German units actually, from the very beginning, actively recruited Black men in particular as drummers. So this was very consistent with sort of European views of Black people being exotic and adding prestige to regiments. So they were often dressed in like turbans and feathers and very colorful outfits.
Wow.
Black drummers were employed by German military in the 18th century already. So I think that when they went to America, it was almost like an opportunity to recruit Black musicians. And they do. And an estimated 200 or so Black men, women, and children, and that's just documented ones. There more went back to Germany with the Corps in over the course of the war in 1783 and settled it in Germany. So that's something I didn't know, and I thought was very interesting.
That is.
And then Native Americans. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. Well, we're talking with Friederike Baer, author of the Hessians, about the German soldiers in the American War for Independence. And you're about to tell us more about Native American, because again, slavery is something they would not, racial slavery is not something they would have known in Germany, nor would they have had experience with Native Americans, but they do everywhere they're fighting. So what can you tell us about their interactions with Native people?
Yeah, most of the descriptions come from the troops that are in Canada, especially members of Burgoyne's army. As we know, there were hundreds of Native Americans that were part of that. And then also in Florida, where there at any given time in Pensacola, Germans say there are like literally thousands of Native Americans coming and going. And some are loyal to the Spanish, some on the British, some are switching sides. You never know, quite know what they're there. Their view is very, very ambivalent. On the one hand, there is a kind of an admiration for what they call, sort of a simpler, morally superior people that treat their own people well. The rich share what they have with the poor, those kind of things. They admire their courage. There is definitely that aspect. One Braunschweig soldier in Canada at some point, he says something like, this is like basically nature in its infancy. I mean, he looks at it as almost this innocent, pure life, including Native Americans. I mean, that's his perspective, who are apparently, presumably not as corrupted, let's say, as Europeans. But at the same time, they are extremely critical and very often very fearful of, especially the practice of scalping, which they see everywhere. They, from their perspective, Native Americans are very unpredictable allies. You never know whether they're gonna be on your side or whether they're gonna turn around and kill you. And we do have documented cases where in Pensacola, for example, a couple of German soldiers are sent out into the woods to cut wood and they're killed by Indians, presumably loyal Indians. So those things happen. Drinking is, Germans at least comment on that.
Really?
They come to your house, they want alcohol. We've been told not to give it to them because this often creates chaos. So you have this very ambivalent view. They're courageous when they are fighting on your side, and you can be sure that they're on your side. They're amazing to have on your side. We can never quite sure. They're just not reliable. And I mean, I think this is a European also, of course. It's not necessarily based on experience. It's the perception or prejudice that they have towards these Americans. But they're very, very detailed. So the Landgraf of Hesse, one quick thing, the Landgraf of Hesse, the ruler of Hesse, at some point sends a letter to Kniphausen, who was the commander after a while in America, and says, can you direct all the regiments to please collect as many Native American artifacts as you can and bring them back, because I want to add them to my collection.
Wow.
So, does curious.
Does he bring back the collection?
Some evidence that they're sent. Kniphausen himself brings back some natural specimen, crystals, sugar cane, and things like that. They definitely see all of this as an opportunity to increase knowledge about North America.
Interesting. So we're talking with Friederike Baer, Associate Professor of History at the Penn State University, Abington College, and author of Hessians, the German soldiers in the American War for Independence. Jonathan Lane reminds me that there were 10 German prisoners of war in Northampton, Massachusetts, who then were hired out. They were part of the Convention Army, and they would be hired out. And they were such good workers that other towns began petitioning the Massachusetts treasurer, who was responsible for them, to send more German prisoners to help out. I don't know. I don't know what happened to these 10 individuals, if they stayed on or if they went back to Germany. But that's so they are fighting everywhere and dying everywhere.
Yeah.
And what are their, so we've talked a bit about their experiences with the Native Americans and with the institution of slavery. What about encounters with, say, Americans, either as soldiers or as civilians? Do they have much to say about this?
Yeah, so generally civilians, when they get, so the first major, like really large contingents arrive in New York in the summer of 76 and then early fall of 76. And so these are the first impressions. There are other troops in Canada before them, but focus on what becomes. Their impressions are very favorable of the land. It's very prosperous. There is some criticism of white Americans generally. Some German soldiers describe them as lazy. Some describe them as wasteful with resources, things like firewood, for example. They also, I think they expected to come to places like New York and ultimately Philadelphia or Newport and other cities that they quote unquote occupy. I think they came initially with the idea that they would be liberators, liberating the American people from this Congress or whatever.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But it didn't really happen. It didn't really happen. So they were really surprised that they were not necessarily greeted as quite as enthusiastically as they expected. Now, as we all know, there are a lot of loyalists around. They were very happy to see them. In Philadelphia, the Quakers, for the most part, were quite happy to see them arrive in town. But for the most part, they did act in Canada, especially. I think that's pretty clear, like an occupying army, and that there's clearly tension between them and the population, as you can, I think, expect. The German Americans, in particular, German Americans are, for obvious reasons, not happy to see German come fight against them.
Interesting.
German Americans critical of them, sometimes the most critical of all people, one those who read records. The German soldiers, in turn, enjoy when they are in regions that are German, sort of. They like the food. Germantown, for example, there's even a German language newspaper at the time, so they appreciate all of that. But the relationship with German Americans, generally speaking, is not great. Now, I need to qualify that just a little bit because German prisoners of war, and hundreds of them were in places like Lancaster and Reading, PA, and also hired themselves out, probably mostly to German Americans. Some of them got along quite well with their new neighbors and the German American families. So, but generally the perception is not great. Now, soldiers, the German soldiers, when they first get here, they do not have a lot of respect for the American army. They don't think it even looks like an army, like a military, or like a military is supposed to look like.
Yeah.
Many of the men that they encounter and on the battlefield or see in camp or whatever don't wear uniforms. They don't have standard issue weapons, those kind of things. Many seem to be not shaven, their beards. The Germans at the time, especially early in the war, very proudly wear uniforms that identify them as belonging to a particular unit. They have standard weapons. Even if fresh recruits, the neat appearance is very important. They don't see that in the Americans for the most part, and they assume this is sort of rabble. They can't really, yeah. And then the first campaign, I think, in the fall of, to some extent, confirms some of their. The Americans run most of the time. German soldiers often compare the war to a hunt during this early period. And they're very prideful, and arrogant, and that'll take a while for them to realize, well, this is actually an enemy that, if he's the enemy, it may not be skilled, but he makes up in sheer will and determination and fanaticism, what he may not have in experience.
But these perceptions were shared by a lot of others, including Washington when he first saw the men he was supposed to be commanding. Yes, so
that's right. I did at one point in my book, there's a description by a Hessian who's like really critical of the Americans. And I think Washington couldn't have said it better. It's exact. Yeah, absolutely.
And then, of course, von Steuben is comes too. So it's interesting the perceptions he has and of the Americans once he is leading them. We're talking with Friederike Baer, author of Hessians, German Soldiers in the American War for Independence, which is a great book, which does cover this story, the stories of these people which have been there. Now, you're fortunate in being able to read German and bring these stories to light for us. We've mentioned a couple of the sources that have been translated, and you began this thinking you were going to be writing about the Baroness von Riedesel. Is there some source you have found that now you hope to get to a wider audience?
There are a couple of manuscript diaries or parts of diaries that I think would be really interesting to make available. There is actually one diary that was recently published in German, but it's not available in English, and that is the diary of a member of the Hanau artillery. His name is Hildebrand. It's a great diary. He participated in Barry Saint-Leger's expedition into the Mohawk Valley. He was at the siege of Fort Stanwix. And he talks very detailed, talks about his experience. There's a small Hanau contingent that's part of that. He comments extensively on the experience of his men, about the British, also again Native Americans, and then Fort Stanwix, of course. And then he returns to camp. I mean, all of this fails, of course, as we know. He never meets up with Bourbon and all of that. But that's an incredibly rich diary. Again, it was published a few years ago in German. That's sort of on my list of potentially. I think a translation had been in the works, but nothing came of it. I think that's a really great addition on it. And again, another campaign and aspect that I think could be studied more out of the war.
Great. Thank you. We've been talking with Friederike Baer, who is an associate professor of history and the division head for arts and humanities at Penn State's Abington College. And we've been talking about your new book, Hessians, German Soldiers in the American War for Independence. So I want to thank you for joining us and giving this great introduction to this, and recommend the book, available from Oxford University Press. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, who is our producer and our man behind the scenes, and our many listeners. You know, when we started this project, we thought we'd have a few folks in and around Boston listening, and we do. I want to thank our listeners in South Boston, as well as in Frankfurt on Main in Hesse. So folks in Hesse and in Oxfordshire and Asbury Park, New Jersey. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to all those in places in between. And if you are from one of those places, email Jonathan Lane, and he'll send you one of our Rev 250 pins, jlane@masshist.org. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.